Hi, my name is Meausre with Kids at the Core. Today we're going to be talking about using common assessments to measure student growth. I've got some resources for you and some ideas, and it should take about 25 minutes, so let's go ahead and start looking at the presentation. So we're going to talk about common assessments to measure student growth. We're kind of in an age of assessment right now. We have so many options for measuring students. We've got assessments that are both created in our local districts, assessments that are created by individual teachers, and then assessments that are created by third-party vendors. All of which are great opportunities to learn about our students, but we also have to be careful about over-assessing and being very intentional about the assessments and the quality of the tools that we're using, as well as the quality of the data that we get back from using those tools. There are two main types of assessments that are possible to give our students. Summative assessments are what we call assessments of learning. In other words, assessments when the teaching is done and we want to see what students have learned. These are things like final exams or assessments that come at the end of a chapter. They are not opportunities for students to go back and relearn the material as a result of the performance on the exam. On the other hand, we have formative assessments. These are assessments for learning. They're assessments that occur during the instructional process, and instructors can use that information to adjust and redirect the way they're going to be working with the students. Both summative and formatives have their place, but if you're going to be making adjustments and trying to improve instruction for the individual student needs, the formative assessment is going to be the preferable choice. And then we have our external versus internal assessments. External assessments are the ones that are written by a third party, someone outside of the district, someone where the district doesn't have control over what's on the actual assessment tool. Where the internal assessment is something that's developed by the district or the teacher teams themselves. So an example of an external summative might be an advanced placement exam. It occurs at the end of the teaching interval. It's written by a third party, not the teachers. An example of an internal formative might be a common assessment. It's given while instruction is still occurring. It's internal because it's created collaboratively by a group of teachers. There are external formatives, and an example of that might be something like Meausre or NWEA or DIBELS. All of these are external third-party assessments, but they measure student learning. So there's lots of choices. The question then it becomes, is the data that we're getting from administering that assessment more valuable than the instructional time we're losing? Every time we choose to give an assessment, we give up instructional time with our students. Therefore, it's really important that the time that we're giving up produces valuable data that's going to help us to teach better in the future. If the data we get back from those assessments is not informing our instruction and helping us to be better teachers, then perhaps that is either not a good assessment tool or an assessment tool that perhaps should not be used. In common formative assessments, there's really two key components. The first key component is collaboratively designed. In other words, a PLC team or some sort of teacher team has worked together to determine that this is what they want on the assessment. It has to be administered to all students, and it has to be given several times during the quarter or the semester so that it's not just a single assessment. It's multiple assessments that are comparable. The second piece is that the common assessments have to intentionally be created to gauge student growth of the essential skills. That means they probably aren't assessing every single thing that a student is going to be exposed to during the course of a semester. The assessment will be measuring key components of that course or that grade level so that teachers can monitor progress on those key components over time. So, they don't test everything? Probably not. In fact, most of these assessments are going to really be focused on the high impact standards. The high impact skills, the high impact power standards, and they're going to represent what students really need to know to be able to do by the end of the course and to be successful in the next grade. So how can we maximize our time? As we're creating common assessments that are aligned to Common Core or other applicable standards, we want to make sure that the assessments are comparable so that we can actually measure growth. For example, if you were to give a student a really hard assessment about reading skills, such as making inferences, and then give another assessment that's much more difficult about making inferences. You would be able to talk about change in learning, but it would be difficult to quantify that because the two aren't at the same level of complexity. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. So when you're creating your common assessments, teacher teams should really determine what would be assessed first. That means identifying what we want all of our students to know and be able to do. Then the next piece of that is determining how it's going to be assessed. Are we going to give them multiple choice tests, constructed response, or is it a performance test? The third piece of that is determining the complexity of the assessment. In other words, is it easy, medium, or hard? We know that there are certain questions that are going to be more difficult for students than others. So it's important for us to be intentional about the level of complexity within each question. And finally, we use parallel construction when we build the assessments so that they have a similar blueprint, and so therefore they're more easily comparable. When teachers start off in this process, it's important to spend some time looking at some basic curriculum mapping. And if that hasn't been done well, sometimes just using a 3-column chart like this will really help. That first column, that's what we want all students to know and be able to do. What are your major objectives here? The second piece is how will you instruct the students? What are your instructional techniques? What are your resources? What are your books? And then the third column is going to be indicators of student mastery. How do I know that my students learned what was in column 1? Generally, we ask teachers to start here. That's really the cornerstone. If we can't identify what we want all students to know and be able to do, these other 2 columns, they're somewhat irrelevant. So if you know everything that you want the students to be able to do by the end of the instructional interval, that's awesome. The question is, will you assess and reassess all of those particular items to monitor for student growth? Chances are unlikely that everything that you plan on teaching the students will be monitored for growth. So the key is to identify essential skills or knowledge that can be monitored for growth over time. Let's talk a little bit about growth, what it is and what it's not. First of all, growth is not attainment. Attainment is a single data point. We're used to talking about attainment in most classes when we think about a chapter test or a final exam. We're looking at the percentage of questions that a student can get right on a particular topic. The problem with attainment, and how it's different than growth, is it's really not comparing to what the student knew on the first day of class. Whether they would have gotten a 90% if they got the final exam on day 1 or a 0% is not accounted for when you give simply one data point. Growth is looking at more than one data point. So we're looking at change in understanding. How much more does the student know by the end of the course than they did when they started the course? If you're going to look at growth, you do need to cover a reoccurring set of standards or objectives. And the great thing about growth data is it can hopefully influence the way teachers are teaching. So it can cause them to look at the data, pivot, and make adjustments to meet the students where they are and differentiate to their various needs. So if we go back to that first column and we've listed everything we want every student to know and be able to do, now we need to really tease apart what's essential. What are we going to monitor for growth over time? These are definitely things that have the following of 3 characteristics. Larry Ainsworth has done a lot of writing, and so has Doug Reeves, about power standards, and this is a great place to start if you're looking for more information. Standards that have endurance, meaning value beyond the single test date, are pretty important. And standards that have leverage, they can be used in other disciplines, like making inferences. And standards that have the readiness for the next level of learning. In other words, that vertical alignment piece. Those are some of the key ways to start identifying what's essential and what's maybe not essential to monitor for growth. So if we went back to that first column and we looked at everything the teachers were planning on teaching during this time, and then we asked the teacher to highlight or identify those things that were absolutely essential, we can start to get to the point where we're looking at what could be monitored for growth. And this can easily be done by looking at a curriculum map that your district has already created and going through and highlighting those things that are identified as essential. Now the key is these should be skills, not facts. Okay? Because a fact is not something that you're going to be able to provide continual value add throughout the course of the semester. Let's look at this example. If in the first test we're asking students to memorize the date in which Columbus sailed the ocean blue, We could ask a question like this: Columbus sailed the ocean blue in blank, and the student would answer 1492, and we know they've memorized the date. But if we're trying to look at the value add over time, or the growth in this skill over time, how would we assess this again? It'd be really hard, maybe even impossible. So we might say, in what year did Columbus sail the ocean blue? And again, we'd still be asking for a memorization. Now, if that's the only point of the assessment, well then great, you're assessing memorization. And in some areas, that's what we want to do. For example, math facts. We do want to assess memorization. Or sight words. We do want to assess memorization. But here, we're looking for skills. Then maybe we could try something like this. According to this primary source written about Columbus's voyage, make an inference. And then on the next assessment, perhaps we're talking about colonization at the time, we can ask students to make an inference on a primary source about colonization. Now we're tracking growth on making inferences as opposed to memorization of facts. In a traditional classroom, we might have an initial assessment, like a pretest, and sometimes we don't. But when I think about my classroom, I typically ask a question and we'd have a discussion. Like in a chemistry class, I might say, what do you guys think a gas is? And we'd have a discussion about what a gas is. And then we would have a period of time where I'd instruct about gases, and then I'd have a summative assessment about gases, and then we'd move on to the next unit, something entirely different and unrelated. Maybe it would be building on the original unit, but assessment D, that next summative, wouldn't really have much information from assessment B on it. In other words, I really couldn't compare the student's score here on assessment B to the student's score on assessment D and expect to see growth. But what if we had more of a circular approach? So that I've pulled out now all the skills that are repetitive within this particular course, and I assess those on assessment A, B, and C. And the blueprint for assessment A, B, and C is the same, so they're mirrors of each other. We could take that data from assessment A, analyze it, make a pivot point, and start to think about how we're going to make an adjustment based on student needs in the classroom. Go ahead and teach, and by the time we're arriving at assessment B, we have already some instruction that we can get feedback on. Was our instruction working? Are students growing in those particular skills? We analyze that data to find out and pivot again. Perhaps we need to go in a different direction, maybe make some different differentiation, and then continue to teach, landing at the final summative assessment C, where we can look at growth from A to C in those essential skills. So after we've identified those essential skills, it's time for teachers to start thinking about how students are learning and how we can assess that learning. If you're going to make your assessments comparable, they really need to be comparable in three major ways: form, content, and complexity. Form means we're talking about the type of the assessment. So is it multiple choice, or is it fill in the blank, or is it free response? Those are different kinds of variables. We want to keep those variables consistent. So between the assessment A, B, and C, for example, there's the same number of multiple choice questions and the same number of performance tasks. This makes them more easy to compare. In the content versus skills area, we really want to talk about skills that are comparable. You can't talk about a student's understanding of rocks by giving them a weather test. So we need to make sure that we're assessing the same skills over time. And then, of course, there's the area of complexity. We know that everything we teach is not on the same degree of cognitive demand. So therefore, everything we assess probably is not in the same level of cognitive demand either. So here's that example about us understanding rocks and weather. If our first assessment is about rocks and our second assessment is about weather, it's going to be difficult to gauge growth. So we want to make sure that the assessments are about skills that we can look at growth over time. There's a lot of different ways to talk about the level of cognitive demand. There's Bloom's, there's Marzano's, and there's even Webb's depth and knowledge. I found the teachers are most comfortable with Bloom's, so I'm going to stick with Bloom's for the remainder of this presentation, but all of these are great ways to talk about cognitive demand. If we were to think about questions in the remember and understanding area being the lowest level or basic kind of questions, apply and analyze being more of a standard level of questioning, and evaluating and creating being that expanded level of questioning. When we look at the questions on our assessments, we need to make sure that we're keeping track of what level those questions are. I've noticed that teachers have a lot of experience in writing, remembering, and understanding questions, but they're not quite as adept sometimes in applying and analyzing questions. So how do we get questions to be into those levels? Sometimes it means starting with particular stems that lean us in various directions. Let's look at a teacher who covers 4 units. The first unit might be circles, triangles, squares, and hearts. If that teacher was to go ahead with the pre-test, post-test model and look for growth in circles, and then growth in triangles, and then growth in squares, and then growth in hearts, like in our first example, we won't find a consistent thread throughout the entire year to look at growth over time. So what if we were to pull out the essential skills from the circle, the triangle, the square, and the heart? And maybe those essential skills are even the same, like, for example, making inferences finds its way into every single one of those units. So now we're looking at what spirals throughout the year. Then we can design a blueprint that allows us to track growth on similar skills throughout the entire year. A more complicated example might show something like this. If we're looking at passages from literature and passages of information, and we're asking students to read questions and answer about that, if we were to be able to give similar questions on similar standards over time, we would be able to find comparable elements to look at these assessments and look for student growth over time. One of the things that we found helpful is the Assessment Blueprint Development Protocol. This basically breaks it down for teachers to identify the essential strategies and essential skills and knowledge that they would like to assess. And then they select the form of their assessment, whether that's going to be mostly multiple choice. If it is multiple choice, what number of questions, free response, what number of questions, and so on and so forth. And then to determine the number of items that will be located at each level of cognitive demand. So for example, in this situation, analyzing the development of a central theme, this individual has chosen to put 2 multiple choice questions at the standard level. That means that every assessment they write, there will be 2 questions on that particular standard at the standard level. 1 question at the basic level and 1 question at the expanded level. It keeps the pattern the same and helps the assessments to be more comparable. So you know you're not comparing a hard test to an easy test, but you're comparing 2 tests of equal difficulty. It's important to consider your outcomes from the start. If you start writing the assessments and then you realize they're not really matching your outcomes, that can be problematic. So first of all, we want to make sure that our assessments give us growth data over multiple points. And we'll think about the measurement models and how we're going to measure the difference between those 2 assessments. We also have to make sure they're comparable. We can think about the form, the content, what's going to be on that assessment, and then that level of complexity piece. And finally, the assessments need to be given in a reasonable interval. So if I give these tests too close together, I might not have sufficient time for the students to grow, or if they're too far apart, I might not have enough time to get information and make instructional changes as needed. So it's important to decide what your outcomes are from the beginning. I do have some more information available on the website at kidsatthecore.com. You may find the assessment development protocol there and some other items that would be helpful as you go through this process. Thanks a lot for attending, and we're going to break for questions now.